Imagine it for a second. The sun sets over the columns of the forum, the marble shines, merchants shout in every known language, and on the maps, Rome was everything. Literally, never before nor after was such a balance between power, order, and wealth. Not even the United States with its military bases, the Spanish Empire on which the sun never set, or China with its modern Silk Roads. No, only Rome. But like every great empire, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. My name is Enrique Alcaraz Roma. I am an economist graduated from the University of La Sorbonne, and today we're going to learn about the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire. Rome's story begins around the 8th century before Christ. The place, the kingdom of Alba Longa, a city nobody remembers today but which at the time wielded considerable power. The legitimate king, Numitor, is betrayed by his own brother, Amulius, a guy who clearly didn't get the concept of family. Amulius steals the throne, and to ensure no annoying heirs in the future, forces Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal. The Vestals were virgin priestesses of the temple of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, the fire, and he told her that you will never have children in your life. Spoiler, it failed. One day, according to the legend, the god Mars, yet the god of war in ancient mythology, appears to Rhea Silvia and leaves her pregnant with twins, Romulus and Remus. When Amulius hears of it, he goes crazy. He orders the babies killed, actually. But the soldier assigned, like any good secondary character in an epic tale, has a herd and sets them adrift in a basket on the Tiber River. That, by the way, I don't know if it's very benevolent to leave them adrift in a river, but still better than killing them, for sure. The current carries them to the shore, and there something unusual happened. A she-wolf, that we'll call Lupa in Latin, finds them and suckles them. Now, an interesting parenthesis, in Latin, Lupa was also a slang for prostitutes, so some historians think that maybe it wasn't a literal wolf but a marginalized woman who saved them. But well, back to the myth. The boys grew up on the hill, raised by wild animals and by a shepherd named Faustulius and his wife. The twins grow strong, brave, and thirsty for justice. When they discover who they really are, they return to Alba Longa, overthrow Amulius, and restore their grandfather Numitor to the throne. Happy ending, right? Well, not actually. Romulus and Remus decide to found a new city where they had been rescued, but as any Roman entrepreneur would tell you, you cannot have two CEOs. So they argue over who will be the founder of the city and the main power of that city. The debate heats up, words escalate, and then Romulus kills Remus, leaving us one of the most sacred phrases of the Roman Empire. Thus shall perish anyone who tries to scale my walls. A phrase that you might engrave if you ever launch your own startup. On April 21, 753 before Christ, Romulus traces the boundaries of his city. He called it Rome after himself because obviously humility was not a Roman virtue. And so begins the Roman Empire, or, well, so the Romans led us to believe. But the truth about Rome's founding isn't as epic as the legend of Romulus and Remus. No gods descending from the sky, no she-wolves, suckling children, but there was mud, wood, and a lot of strategy. We find ourselves in the 8th century before Christ in a region later known as Latium, in the center of the Italian peninsula. There are no cities, no Rome, just small shepherd villages scattered across the 7 hills that would later form the heart of the greatest empire in history. But why there? Because Rome was strategically located. First of all, it was near the Tiber River, allowing access to trade and transportation, all along the river. Second, it was far enough from the sea to avoid pirate attacks and attacks from other cities or empires bigger than theirs in that time. Third, it was situated at a natural crossroads between northern and southern Italy. It was basically in the middle, more or less where the capital is right now. Rome wasn't founded by a caped hero, but by groups of Latines, Sabines, and Etruscans who gradually forged ties, merged villages, and shared sacred spaces and markets. What began as a cluster of huts in the Palatine Hill steadily consolidated into a larger, more stable community. Archaeology confirms that around 750 before Christ, there was already urban infrastructure that is crucial for a region's economic development. There were rudimentary streets, communal temples, necropolises, and a primitive form of tribal political organization. The word Rome probably didn't come from Romulus, but from the Etruscan or Latin term related to Roma, that was breast or hill, or even from an older root meaning simply river. Over the following centuries, that primitive Rome would absorb other tribes, defend itself from neighboring peoples, and above all, become something very rare for that time. A city that not only resisted but united different people under one name. Rome wasn't born from a single spark. It was a process, a sum of communities that unknowingly they were writing the first chapter of a story that would last more than 1,000 years. But how can we explain that a territory, this territory so small, these shepherd villages could go from this to this? Well, this is thanks to economics. In fact, Rome's economic development wasn't a miracle, it was a consequence. As the villages of the Palatine and other hills began forming a single urban nucleus, Rome ceased to be just a point on the map and started becoming a point of exchange. On one hand, its strategic position amid routes linking Etruria to the north, Campania to the south, and the peninsula's interior, and on the other hand, its variation and ethnic compositions. There were Latins, Sabines, Etruscans, which made Rome a kind of cultural fusion where ideas, techniques, and products circulated freely. In the early centuries, the Roman economy was agricultural and pastoral. Wealth was measured in land and livestock. The most powerful citizens were the patres, owners of vast rural estates. Their economic, political, and religious authority shaped what would later become the Senate. But Rome didn't take long to look beyond its fields. Etruria began sending fine pottery, bronze weapons, water channeling techniques, and in return, Rome offered cereals, salt, and labor. The Tiber became the gateway for goods, and Rome's port at Ostia grew little by little. As trade increased, so did something subtler yet even more important, that was trust. Rome began forging its reputation not only by force, but by its capacity to enforce agreements, protect trade routes, and punish rule breakers. There, unknowingly, they were planting the seeds of something bigger than money, that is institutional stability. And that is the real foundation of any solid economy, and that was Rome at the time. You know, Rome didn't invent commerce, but it did pioneer something more ambitious, that was creating an economy where trade, politics, and law worked together. Thanks to that, by the mid-6th century before Christ, Rome was no longer an ambitious village. It was a city-state with law, roads, walls, and a dream that smelled of expansion. During this period, Rome invested in public infrastructure, the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's first sewer systems, the Roman Forum as a center of commerce and civic life, and a network of roads connecting the city with rural surroundings. You know, there is a said, I don't know if you say it in the US, but at least here in Spain, we say that all roads lead to Rome. And this is why this expression was created, thanks to all this network of roads connecting the city with all the surroundings. But this wasn't just engineering, it was pure economics. Better roads meant more goods that could be exported and imported. Sewers meant a greater population density that overall would boost Rome's GDP. Temples and forums would entail more trust in institutions and also more taxes for the region. Over time, the Etruscan monarchy was overthrown and the Roman Republic was established in 509 before Christ. And with it, Rome's economic machine took off. Because what followed was a combination that a few people achieved in that time. Territorial expansion, political institutions, and an economy based on conquest and integration. Rome began conquering neighbor cities not just to dominate them, but to integrate them into its economic network. They were allowed to keep their cults, their lands, their leaders, but in exchange they had to pay tributes, send soldiers, and adopt the Roman model. The entire Italian peninsula filled with Roman roads, which were not only pathways for legends but highways of trade, money, and fiscal control. In this context, the use of something called ice route, that were basically bronze ingots as means of exchange, also emerged, later evolving into actual coins. Because Rome understood something that bankers and emperors would reiterate centuries later. A common currency creates economic unity, and unity brings power. During the 3rd century before Christ, Rome had already unified almost the entire Italian peninsula, but like any teenage-phase empire, it wanted more. More lands, more enemies, more glory, and so began a series of wars that would not only transform its politics, but its economy forever. Welcome to the Punic Wars. From 264 to 146 before Christ. 3 brutal conflicts between Rome and Carthage, the great naval power of the Western Mediterranean, lasted over 100 years. Obviously, a century yields many tales, but mainly we must know that the Romans crushed the Carthaginians, and with that victory came the grand prize: the control of Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, and later on Hispania and North Africa. But the most important thing wasn't just the territories, it was what came with them. Gold, silver and wheat, thousands and thousands of slaves, and new provinces from which extract tributes and raw materials for the empire. And here is where the Roman economy shifts face. From a peasant economy to one slave world latifundia. The patricians or the senatorial elite bought vast tracts of land in the new provinces and exploited them with slave labor. And you might think, what happened to the small Roman farmers that already lived there? Well, they were basically displaced, ruined, or they simply sold their lands and left. Many went to Rome seeking work, and the only things that they found were free bread and spectacles. Literally, panem and circumstance, that was the economic slogan of Roman populism. Meanwhile, the victorious general amassed fame, riches, and political ambitions because in Rome, military success made you a millionaire and a candidate as a politician. Gold flowed like never before, but so did inequality, and what had begun as a rural economy based on the virtue of these citizen soldiers ended as a system where the rich lived off plunder and the poor of subsidies. In the middle of all this, the denarius was born, the legendary Roman silver coin. Created in the 211 before Christ, it became the symbol of a monetized, centralized and connected economy. A coin accepted in Hispania, Egypt, Asia Minor, a coin that told the world, you are in Roman territory. But remember this for later, the empire that feeds on war needs constant war to keep going. And when the spoils run out, collapse begins. Rome was rich, filthy rich. The gold of Hispania, the wheat of Egypt, the spices all from the east, rich ports of the Tiber. But there was a small detail. Wealth was poorly distributed. While the patricians hoarded lands and slaves, the smallholders, those who had fought in the wars, returned home to find no home. The lands were now in latifundi's hands, and slaves did the work for next to nothing. The result? An army of impoverished citizens, landless, jobless, hopeless, but with the right to vote. And there steps in Tiberius Gracchus. Tiberius Gracchus was a young tribune who proposed something radical, at least for the rich. Distribute public lands amongst the poor citizens, an agrarian reform. And how did Rome's elite respond? With daggers. Tiberius was assassinated by a group of senators. 10 years later, his brother Gracius Gracchus tried the same and met the same end. The Gracchi family were the first to fall, but not the last. They didn't know it yet, but Rome had entered a new stage, one in which political violence was no longer the expectation, it was the norm. We can see various examples all along these years that, reaffirms what I just said. First of all, Marius and Sulla, 2 generals who clashed with their own armies in a civil war. In Rome, the majestic Rome, there was a civil war. Second, Spartacus, the slave who put the very slave system on the edge. That, by the way, the movie Gladiator is inspired on him, on this slave. And shortly after, Julius Caesar, a charismatic, wealthy, popular man loved by the people, feared by the state. Caesar defied the Senate, marched his army into Rome and seized power. But he doesn't do it as a king, he does it as a perpetual dictator. And if we've learned something so far, is this: Rome could tolerate anything except a king. On March 1544 before Christ, they stabbed him 23 times in the Carria itself. But reports say that the second stab already killed him, so the other 21 were already just for fun, just for playing with him. They believed that they had saved the Republic, but they actually didn't. all they did was to open the door to empire. After decades of civil wars, betrayal, assassinations, and venomous speeches in the Senate, Rome was exhausted. And then he arrived, Octavian Augustus, Julius Caesar's adopted son. He defeated Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium, charmed the people, tamed the Senate, and in 27 before Christ, he presented himself with humility, saying, "I don't want absolute power, only to serve you. Be kind to me." Lie. But a lie so well told that the Senate himself or theirself gave him everything. The title of Augustus, control of the army, the treasury, the provinces, and the narrative. Because from then on, the Republic no longer existed, only its memory. Augustus understood something that many emperors afterwards would forget. Political power only survives if there is economic prosperity, and so was born the Pax Romana. 2 centuries of stability, roads, security, and commerce, sustained by an administrative machine designed to last a long time. First of all, the silver denarius was revalued. They were more valuable, let's say like that. Second, fiscal laws were unified all along the territory. Third, a network of more than 80,000 kilometers of Roman roads was built. Fourth, imperial customs, ports, and fiscal warehouses were established all along the empire. And with that came the flow of goods, of people, of ideas. The Roman Empire's economy was like a huge, noisy machine. A machinery that functioned thanks to millions of human gears, from senators to slaves, from money changers to farmers. But how did it work exactly? If I had to sum it up in one single sentence, I'd personally say that the modern economic system was established with barely any study of economics. When we analyze the Roman Empire, we see that most things done at the time are being done every day in our society. Let's start with the basics: production, transportation, and consumption. Rome had no factories, no electricity. The engine of its economy was the countryside. 90% of the population lived in rural areas. They cultivated cereals, wheat, and barley mainly, vines, olives, vegetables, and as we saw before, the dominant model was the latifundia, large agricultural estates worked by slaves. And this latifundia not only supplied the cities, but also generated surpluses for export. Rome imported the cheaper grain from North Africa or Egypt, stored it in state granaries, and distributed it free to the poor citizens of the capital. Yes, it was kind of like a primitive form of social security, but in a form of bread and grain and cereal in general. At the time, the empire controlled some of the richest mines in the ancient world. Silver in Hispania, gold in Dacia, that's modern Romania, copper, lead, and tin in Britannia, marble in Greece and Asia Minor. These resources were all state property and they were centralized. Their exploitation was organized through contracts, concessions, and forced labor, like we do it right now. The mines financed public spending, the army, and the emperor's ego, via monuments, baths, and circuses. A fiscal system also existed that collected taxes from its citizens, and the Romans did it methodically. Kind of similarly on how we do it right now, there were direct and indirect taxes. Direct taxes consisted of land, people, and property. And indirect taxes like the portarium, so customs, were taxed on what they bought. Taxes on sales, inheritances, and rent. Each province had to pay tribute to the state, but was allowed some autonomy to collect it locally. The result was a complex but yet effective fiscal network that kept the army, administration, and free bread in Rome running. All this system was possible thanks to a monetary union spanning the entire empire. As we've said, the silver denarius was the star of the monetary system and the economic system of Rome overall. Gold coins, aureos, and bronze coins, sestertius or maybe dupondius, depending on how they say it, also circulated, but the main was the denarius, the silver coin. The currency had 3 key functions. First, facilitate trade in huge empires, thousands of kilometers wide. As we said, they had 80,000 kilometers of roads, only roads. Imagine the land, the magnificent land that they had at that time. Also, they were used for paying soldiers and officials, and finally to transmit propaganda. In addition, there was a financial class. Money changers, lenders, bankers were called agentari. They made written contracts, promissory notes, deposit loans. But, by the way, interest rates at the time were very negatively seen. They were, but only in very specific cases, and it was not available to everybody. So you couldn't make a lot of money thanks to money lending at the time. But well, just a fun fact. Just thinking about the network that the Romans had set up amazes me and makes me wonder one thing. What would our society look like if we had, in some kind of way, gone back to the past during the Middle Age? Actually, tell me down in the comments, what do you think? What do you think that our society would look like today if we didn't pass this Middle Age and it was all a continuation of this classical epoch? But well, we have seen the extraction and mining, we have seen the public spending in the financial system established at the epoch. But we still need to see the artery, the central pillar for which the Roman Empire was so great and so glorious, that was trade. Each region of the empire specialized in producing and extracting the goods in which they held their comparative advantage and exchanges their surpluses to those other regions, allowing a much lower cost than if each region had tried to hoard everything and all the production. Centuries later, an economist called David Ricardo would propose just that same thing with his theory of comparative advantage. And he will always be remembered as the creator of comparative advantage. Nevertheless, the Romans were already applying it before even Jesus Christ was even born. Thus, Rome was a globalized economy. This is amazing. The Mediterranean was their blue highway. It was like the main part of the Roman Empire, and it makes sense if you look at the territory they occupied. Roman roads allowed goods to travel fast and safely inland with no need to go, well, through the sea. That, by the way, Romans didn't like the sea. They were fans, for example, as the Greeks. And there were regional markets, fairs, and even transcontinental routes with India and China via silk, the Silk Road, spices, precious stones. Amazing. By the way, I will make a video about that same Silk Road explained in some kind of way of this video, like similarly to this video. So if you're liking this video, I recommend you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any videos like this that I can make in the future. Well, the state, actually, going back to the video, the state even guaranteed trade. It protected the routes, intervened in prices when shortages arose, and offered subsidies to import grain or build merchant ships. Rome knew that a strong economy wasn't based only on riches, but on guaranteeing their circulation. Its economic system was simply very advanced, very comparable with our current systems. And so for 2 centuries the system worked. It wasn't perfect because there was slavery, inequality, and corruption, but well, there was one thing that Romans knew how to do better than anyone. Turn power into stability and stability into wealth. Rome was so prosperous and spectacular that even God himself came down in a human form to see what was happening. Though things ended, well, pretty badly for him, but well, he died for us all. Rome had created the most powerful economy of the antiquity, a network of cities connected by roads, markets, taxes, precious metals, a single, simple, unified currency, and slaves. Everything seems eternal, but as you know, eternity in history doesn't exist. We find ourselves in the 3rd century after Christ. The empire is divided, too large, too expensive to maintain, and while emperors change faster than propaganda posters, the economy starts to break. First came inflation. For centuries, the Roman denarius was a symbol of trust. But emperors needed more money to pay soldiers, subsidies, public wars, military campaigns, and since they didn't have it, they did what many governments would do centuries later. They began reducing the amount of silver in the coins. What was once almost 100% silver and had real value ended up being recycled scrap with an emperor's face. And of course, more coins meant less value, which meant higher prices. A sack of wheat that once cost 1 denarius now costs 10. Why? Because that denarius is less valuable. Money lost value before people's eyes, and the people who weren't stupid began using something else. Barter. Imperial money? Nah, thanks. Better paying grain, wine, or a goat. Real tangible things. Now, If we're smart enough, we could wonder, but what if, if money was falling apart, what about taxes? Well, simple, they became impossible to pay. So the whole financial system starts to malfunction. Farmers were ruined, cities lost population, lands were abandoned, and the state, desperate, raises tax even more, which, was basically useless. In economics, we call this a death spiral. The economic situation of a person, company, or a country worsens gradually, generating negative effects that worsen it even further. And as icing on the cake, there came the political crisis. In just the 3rd century, Rome had more than 20 emperors, many of them military men, proclaimed by their own troops and assassinated months later by another military man. This caused instability. Trade routes became unsafe because, they were occupied fighting amongst themselves instead of protecting those roads. Cities stopped investing and confidence overall vanished. And then came a man who wanted to save it all, an emperor named Diocletian. In 284 after Christ, he seized absolute control and decided that the only way to save the empire was to reinvent it from scratch. Year 284. Rome is on fire, metaphorically and sometimes, literally. Emperors now last barely longer than a Spanish government term without corruption or any institutional crisis. The coins are worthless, the army is on the verge of unity, and the provinces act like independent kingdoms. And in the midst of chaos steps in a soldier of humble origin, disciplined, called as imperial marble, Diocletian. He didn't come to rule, he came to reform, and boy did he. The first thing he did was to admit what no other wanted to say out loud. This is too big for one man. So he basically split it. At the east, richer, more urban, more grain. And the west, more rural, more conflict, more problems. But he wasn't happy with one division, no, he actually invented the tetrarchy. 2 senior emperors who were called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, that were called Caesars. They were basically 4 men to run an empire. A sort of a board of directors with, basically, swords. Basically, he did what Adam Smith said a lot of centuries later with the labor division. Did it work? For a time, yes, but like every startup with too many founders, it ended in fistfights. Diocletian knew that the economy was broken, galloping inflation, collapsed trade, barter on the rise, so he did what any emperor with a fascist accounting complex would do. The Edict of Maximum Prices in the year 301. A decree that fixed the price of everything. A pound of bread cost so much, a nice toga so much. Killing a cow without the state permission, you get a fine. Raising prices without permission, death penalty. Death penalty for speculation. Basically, the most ambitious and desperate price control in ancient history. Did it work? Of course not. Such regulation has never worked in history and never will, because we must understand price as the variable that balances supply and demand, which keeps the economy afloat. If you cap it, the economy becomes unbalanced, production stops, wealth generation stalls, and that always leads to a severe crisis. The same is happening right now in Barcelona, Spain, for example, with the rent cap and with the housing market. But that is the topic for another video. Again, subscribe if you want me to explain it. The thing is that merchants hid goods, the black market exploded, and the edict was a disaster. Diocletian also knew that the Roman tax system was a joke. Evasion everywhere, unclear records, whole provinces paying neither spiritual nor literal VAT. So he reformed everything. First, he made detailed censuses of people, land, and animals. Second, he established a system of fixed rates with no room for evasion. And third, taxes no longer paid only in money, which was at that time worthless because, the magic of the silver and the denarius disappear, but in kind. Wheat, oil, meat, wool. If you had no coins, it actually didn't matter. The state took your hands. And to ensure that taxes were paid, trades became hereditary. So if you were a baker, your son would be a baker too. If you were a tanner, so would your grandson. If you grew wheat, congratulations, you'd be growing it until the end of days. Diocletian reform stabilized the chaos. Yes, for a while. Money regained value, collection improved. The state worked again as a tax-raising, army-paying machine, but at a price. Economic freedom disappeared. And with no economic freedom, there is no innovation. And with no innovation, there is no economic progress, there is no growth. You were no longer a mobile citizen of the empire. You were a fixed piece, a number in a census, an obliged provider, and that would be the prelude for feudalism and this going back in time in the Middle Age. Because when the urban economy collapsed, people left the cities and sheltered in rural villas, under protection of the landowners who, spoiler, very soon would be called feudal lords. Diocletian left power voluntarily in 305 after Christ. He retired to his palace in Dalmatia where he grew cabbages, literally cabbages. When they offered him to rule back again amid the new chaos, he replied, "If you sold the cabbages I'm cultivating, you wouldn't make me that offer." The man who saved Rome knew that he had done something that couldn't last forever. In 312 after Christ, a new emperor appeared with a cross in his hand, Constantine. Converted to Christianity, he restructured power and founded a new capital in the east, Constantinople. Rome was still there, proud, monumental, but ever emptier. The elites no longer lived there. Trade had shifted eastward and the western provinces were increasingly poor, rural, and vulnerable. And with that came Germans, Goths, Vandals, Huns, that they had spent generations at the border watching. But now Rome was weak, and they started the invasion. The thing is that Rome, some years before that, would have destroyed them with a mere raised eyebrow. But actually they could no longer held their frontier because there was no gold left, because the army was expensive, because many Roman soldiers were already barbarians, actually Goths that were recruited to defend Rome from Goths, which was a brilliant plan until they stopped getting paid, and then they basically switched sides. And in the year 410 after Christ, there is the first symbolic blow. Alaric, the king of the Visigoths, enters Rome, not with a speech, but with a sword. Rome is stacked for the first time in 800 years. Houses burn, statues melt, sacred relics disappear, and a guy called Jerome that writes from the actual Palestine, the city that conquered the world, has been destroyed. But it wasn't the end yet, only the announcement. In 455 after Christ, we can see the second fall. As the Vandals arrive from North Africa, this time the sack is longer, more systematic, they take everything from gold to slaves, and even if the Pope tries to mediate, the Romans pray, but the ancient world is no longer listening. In 476 after Christ, game over. A Germanic general named Odoacer said a phrase that would mark the end of an era. "We don't need more emperors in the West." That year, Romulus Augustus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, is deposed. No war, no glory, simply replaced. Rome didn't fall, it faded like a candle that burns down slowly until nothing but smoke remains. The Senate dissolved, the roads grew over with grass, temples became churches, and global trade turned into rural autarky. The world became small again. But not everything was darkness, because in the east, in Constantinople, the Roman Empire lived on for another 1,000 years. They called it the Byzantine Empire, but they called themselves the same as always: Romans. And that is all for today. It took a lot of effort to make this video, so if you liked it, I'd appreciate it if you gave it a like, and if you subscribe for more content like this. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end, and I'll see you in the next video. Ciao!